Do I just start or?
Yeah, you can start by introducing yourself.
Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, introduce yourself first, and then we can come to the main body.
Oh no, okay. Hello, I'm Arthur. I'm a grade 10 student at UCC, and over the past few months, I've been working on graphing the historical evolution of Asian hate crime, and here are my results in the form of a presentation. So let's get started. So we're first going to go over some background, then some literature review. We're going to go over some research motivation and research questions, then the methods that were used, and then the findings, and finally some conclusions and discussions. So background. Discrimination due to arbitrary differences have been around for a very, very long time. And one of these forms of discrimination is anti-Asian hate crimes. And yeah, but however, we found that this form of hate crime isn't as well studied as some other forms of hate crimes. And due to the origin of COVID-19 being from China, there's been a negative stigma against Asians for bringing the pandemic to the Americas. And there have been many examples of this. One of them was a quote from the US ex-president Donald Trump, who has called COVID-19 the Chinese virus more than 20 times between March 16th and March 30th during 2020. And as a result of this negative stigma, there's been an increase in the amount of hate crimes, and particularly against Asians. One example of this hate crime is on March 16th, 2020, when several teens have vandalized a store in Chinatown at San Francisco. And there's a picture of this to the right. And additionally, a survey performed by the University of Toronto has shown that 11% of respondents have been the target of some sort of discrimination. So now we can go into some literature review of similar studies that have been performed. So first, one study of over 30 million tweets from 2015 to 2018 has shown that living in states with higher than 10% negative sentiment from their analysis on the tweets is correlated with higher amounts of inequality in income and jobs. There's also been a book that's been published about the geography of hate and how certain regions in the US are more prone to hate crimes, and it's called Spaces of Hate, and it's cited. And alternatively, there have also been studies in the past that have focused on how politics are related to hate crimes and how politicians differ in reaction to these crimes. There have also been other ones, for example, one from the Pew Research Center, which has shown that there's been an increased discrimination against Blacks and Asians during the pandemic. Other ones that have investigated in the discrimination and well-being among Asians in America on social media during COVID-19. And finally, some different studies that have done more research towards the mental health aspect of Asians during the pandemic. So now, with finishing the background and some some research, we can formulate some research questions. So our first research question was about how crimes involving Asian discrimination in the USA evolved over time. And so by examining a correlation between the criminal acts of discrimination, it is possible to see why others commit hate crimes. And using this information, the answers to this research question will matter because deterring these crimes will help the victims to feel safe and included in society. And this information can provide insights to other types of discrimination against different races, or for example, during an entirely different pandemic situation entirely, and be a helpful stepping stone towards the reduction of racism. Our second question was, how does Asian hate crime vary geographically? And which locations have received the most amount of hate crimes during the pandemic in the USA? So the answers to this research question can help to identify regions and as well as potential solutions for these problems, so that more targeted solutions can be applied. And additionally, this can help establish a correlation between the characteristics of problematic regions and the prevalence of racism or other hate crimes. And this information can also discern whether hate crimes are more concentrated towards certain areas, or if it's a more widespread problem across America, as well as help determine the severity of the issue of hate crimes. Our last research question was, how does Asian hate compare to other hate crimes, such as anti-Black and anti-Semitism? And by comparing which groups are the most vulnerable, there will be more ways in which more targeted support can be applied or developed to suit the needs of those groups. Similarly, determining the severity of hate crimes will provide information regarding the scale of a potential solution that the government or citizens can take in order to discourage these actions. And finally, by finding similarities between hate crimes against different races, we can establish a correlation and help to find a solution for the target demographic. So now we can move on to a research method. So we have two total data sets. The first one is from the FBI, and as you can see in the picture to the right, and it provides information about hate crimes that are in the USA from 1991 to 2018. And in total, as you can see from the left row, more than 200,000 hate crimes were documented and has a lot of information. Our second data set was from the NYPD, which has hate crimes, which details hate crimes that were committed in New York from a more recent timescale, from 2019 to 2020. And although there's only documents 91 total cases, and the time range is less, it also contains more information and more details about each hate crime. So now moving on to findings and answering our research questions. So our first research question was about the historical evolution of Asian hate crimes. And the graph to the left is from the FBI dataset, and it shows the anti-Asian crime rate in the USA from 1991 to more recent to 2018. And the graph to the right shows is from the NYPD dataset, and it shows the numbers of felonies versus misdemeanors of anti-Asian offenses in New York, and that can be seen from the two lines. So from these two graphs, we can see that there are spikes in March of 2020 due to the quarantine outbreak of COVID, as well as in the graph to the right, there are spikes during the summer and when quarantine is reinstated. And while in the graph to the left, you can see that there's an increase in hate crime in 1995, although it gradually tapers off later. And now moving on to some more state comparisons, we see that in larger states such as California, there's a large spike during 1995, as seen before. And we think this may be because of events such as the Oklahoma City bombing, which showed the negative sentiment present at the time. And racism has been on the decline ever since then. And in states with less population, as you can see on the graph to the right, the reduced number of cases means that there's a higher volatility due to random fluctuations, and that's why the graph on the right is a lot more spiky and unreliable. And if we zoom out, these graphs are a bit harder to see, but these are the graphs of all 50 states. And among these states, we notice that ones such as AZ, Arizona, CA, CO, ID, these are just all the state codes, and they're listed out on the presentation. And they all had a generally decreasing trend, we noticed from the graphs, while others such as CT, FL, KY, and VT had an increasing trend. And finally, the other types of graphs were either flat or empty because there wasn't enough data to cover those states. So moving on to answering our second research question, which is about how anti-Asian hate varies across states. So to answer this research question, what we did was we plotted a choropleth graph, which is essentially a fancy heat map, and we used that data from the FBI dataset to make the heat map of the USA, and we plotted it according to a natural logarithm. And in this map, we can see that lighter colors will mean higher frequencies of hate crimes. And over here, California can be seen to have the largest amount of hate crimes, and we hypothesized that it may be due to its large population. And when zooming out and taking a look at some 5-year intervals from 1991 to 1995, 1996 to 2000, etc., we made 6 graphs, and overall, we see from the graphs that California still had the most hate crime, but however, states with the least hate crime were usually in the middle-ish, and they are probably due to either a lack of data points or some other reason. And moving on to answering our third research question, which was graphing anti-Asian hate crimes versus other hate crimes. So again, we used our handy FBI dataset to graph the aggregate hate crime victim count from our entire dataset. And as we can see, the anti-Black or African-American victim count was the highest at almost 70,000, and the other ones are just plotted to the right. And key thing to notice is that anti-Asian hate crimes had roughly, I don't know, 6,000 victims, and they were the 8th most prominent hate crime across the USA from this data set. However, if you look at our NYPD dataset and graph the frequency, we see a different story. So in New York from 2019 to 2020, anti-Jewish hate crimes was much more prominent than other forms of hate crimes. And over here, anti-Asian was the 5th most prominent hate crime. And this difference in results could be due to the more recent nature of the data, or it could be due to more regionalized sentiments that are different from more general national ones. What? Okay. Conclusion. So, in conclusion, some of our findings are, in general, California had the most amount of hate crimes, possibly due to its high population. The majority of states had a decreasing trend of hate crime frequency, but a few of them had an increasing amount of hate crime, although their data was often sparse and spiky and volatile. There's also a correlation between Asian hate crimes and other hate crimes, such as anti-Black, although they differ significantly in their frequency. And with the onset of COVID-19, there's been a significant spike seen in anti-Asian hate crimes, especially during the March of 2020. So, as the level of hate crimes in general have been on a decline since 1995, current measures we think, are sufficient in promoting equality. However, key things to note is that the recent spike in anti-Asian hate crimes means that additional measures should be implemented to support more vulnerable populations, which is always good. And states such as California should take warning and introduce ways to combat hate crimes, as well as the other states that had a generally increasing trend. And some current limitations of our data set. So we only use 2 data sets, and although they were pretty large data sets, we still end up needing some data to fill out the less populous states, as well as people that do not report for minor cases. For example, over here we have, if someone undergoes constant harassment from hate or hate crimes, quote unquote crimes, but they're minor cases, they might not think it's worth the hassle to report to the police, and thus we will miss some occurrences, as well as there are some biases in the current data set based off of police data, which does not have a lot of qualitative analysis. And so some extensions to the study would be doing a more careful study of municipalities within a state, as our current study was pretty general and more focused on the entirety of the US. And by doing a more careful study, we can see how the differences will contribute towards the total amount of hate crimes for that state, as well as for the entire nation. We can also compare the amount of hate crimes across borders and see how they vary across the world, as the ethnic majority changes as well as their beliefs. And this would help countries find commonalities between how their populations react to world events. And finally, we could also be using more data sets, as mentioned earlier, to extend the scope of this current study by comparing the results of states, and especially to fill in the blanks of the states that we found to have less or no data at all. And here are references, and yep, that's it. I just like put that in the middle. Yes, completely normal transition. Uh, okay, blah blah blah. We've also made a graph we can see to the right that are plotting the amount of victims for Asian and Black hate crimes in the U.S. from 1991 to 2015. And over here, the blue is the Asian victim count, while the yellow is the amount of Black victims. And after doing some statistical analysis, we found that the Pearson value between the number of Asian and Black victims, which is their correlation, is 0.755, with a p-value of 3.36 times 10 to the negative 6. And so we can see that there's clearly some correlation between the levels of hate against different races and minorities, as seen here. And also, we noticed that the number of victims were highest during the 1996 to 2000 period, and it has decreased ever since. And this shows that there's been progress towards reducing the number of hate crimes. And we can also see that this data correlates pretty well with the initial line graph that we had in the beginning. Yeah.
Okay.